So hopefully, can everybody just see the title slide? All right, awesome. I'm gonna minimize that and I'm gonna go ahead and turn my video off because it's distracting myself. All right, so my name is Shana Boyer. I am a full-time grad student at USF in the anthropology department, specifically focusing on archaeology. And so originally, when I got into this, I was going to be doing a few different things, which I will get into in a moment. So my research questions going into this were, what was the day-to-day life like for a wealthy family on the Florida frontier? And what about their medicine practices and ideas centered around health? And how did the Patton family specifically, which is what this topic is on, play into the idea of conspicuous consumption? And so some of the hiccups that I ran into was that this was originally supposed to be a macrobotanical analysis of a post-Civil War privy in conjunction with the ceramics. However, due to COVID, that changed the trajectory and I turned to focusing specifically on the ceramics and glass bottles found in the privy. And you can see on the top map where the privy is located about a little northeast of the Gamble Mansion, directly behind the kitchen area. And when we first found it, we didn't know that it was a privy until it was hit upon in the 2018 field season. And the bottom image is just a map showing where the Gamble Plantation is in Florida, specifically Manatee County, just south of the Skyway Bridge. So the plantation was established by Major Robert Gamble Jr. in 1844, and it was sold in 1858 to Louisiana planters John Cofield and Robert Davis. And they bought it, the plantation, and everything that it came with, including the 190 enslaved individuals and all of the sugar plantation works and everything like that, for $190,000. And then the Civil War happened. And in 1862, Confederate Captain Archibald McNeil became stationed there, which sent Cofield and Davis back to Louisiana. And he was there with his wife and children for the entirety of the Civil War. And this was utilized by the Confederacy to house items that they may need to help them with the war. This is also where Confederate Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin hid in 1865 on his way out of Florida. And then, so Gamble sold the plantation to Cofield and Davis, like I said, and then after the Civil War, it was sold in 1873 to George Patton for $3,000, which is a very small amount compared to the previous $190,000. And the reason for this is because in 1871, Gamble's brother-in-law, McFarland, his executors foreclosed on the plantation for non-payment of the mortgage, which led to Patton purchasing the property at auction for such a low amount. Later on, the Patton house was built and the Gamble Mansion was used as a boarding house. And then eventually the property was bought by the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1925. And I am going to warn you guys, this is a very history-rich presentation just because so much was happening in this area during this time. So we start off with a broad example of looking at broadly Victorian America, which is named for the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 to 1901. And the biggest thing that heralded in the Victorian era in the United States was the emergence of railways, as well as the settlers' drive to expand westward. And the westward expansion was also seen historically as a form of imperialism similar to that was carried out in Britain. And this is particularly noticeable in the southeastern United States, specifically Florida, with the forced removal of the Seminole Native Americans as settlers moved south. There are also a few different names for this period. The Jacksonian period, which was 1824 to roughly 1840, which also coincides with Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, which theorized that American democracy was formed by the American frontier, as well as Andrew Jackson's election as president and his influence on American politics. He specifically thought that every citizen was equally as important, but this also left out a majority of people in the United States, including the freed Africans and women. So specifically, he thought that white male and landowners were considered equal. It was also known as the Gilded Age, which ran from roughly 1870 to the early 1900s and was seen as an era of rapid economic growth that pushed America to be the leading industrial power that eventually rivaled Britain in mass production, consumerism, capitalism, and urbanism. The other names for this include antebellum and postbellum, which refer to before and after the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era, which was after the emancipation of slavery and included trying to reintegrate the South into the Union and was big for advocating the redistribution of land and equal rights in the South. This was also a huge time of leisure for many Americans in that, and there were various ways that people kind of practiced this. We also see like the first instance of 3D images with the stereoscope, which I will show you guys in like images of in the next slide. The camera obscura, as well as the kaleidoscope, which were used to mostly entertain indoors. And then when outdoors, many families would travel inland from coastal areas to escape malaria and yellow fever seasons, which tended to coincide with the summer seasons. And this also came with improved transportation, such as private turnpikes and toll roads, due to poor condition of publicly financed roads. And so these are, you see the image of the glass kaleidoscope. The top image is the stereoscope, which looking through, you see two images side by side, and it creates a 3D image. And the bottom one is an example of an early camera obscura, in that using a set of mirrors can project an image onto something. So specifically in Florida, the Armed Occupation Act of 1842 is what brought settlers south, and it provided planters 160 acres of free land and a year's worth of rations from the federal government if they worked on that land for 5 years. And because of the rise in investors and immigrants during this period, there are more railroads being built that go south from Jacksonville all the way to Tampa and even all the way over to Pensacola, eventually creating 3,500 miles of completed railroad tracks. We also see more commercial and agricultural development in the form of timber, citrus, and cattle industries. And Florida cattle herders is where people believe the term cracker originated due to the 18-foot long braided whips and the rifle-like noise they made when the cattle herders were moving their cattle around. And timber and citrus specifically replaced the sugar and cotton industries in Florida. We also have a huge influx of specifically Spanish immigrants into the area. And a big part of this is due to Vicente Ybor bringing his cigar factory from Cuba to Key West and eventually Tampa. And so Vicente Ybor was a Spanish entrepreneur and was the first notable cigar manufacturer in Cuba. And in 1885, he brought that to Tampa and eventually what became Ybor, or Ybor City. And because of this rich Latin culture and specifically immigrants from Cuba, Spanish, and Italian areas, it eventually became known as Little Havana. And you can see in the upper picture, that is an artist depiction of what these Florida cattle herders or crackers looked like. And the biggest image is Vicente Ybor, and the smaller one is actually his cigar factory that was built when he came here, which is actually now the Church of Scientology building. And during this time, Florida saw a lot of conflict. We saw the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842, the Third Seminole War from 1854 to 1856, which was also known as the Billy Bowlegs War, which is the first image on the left-hand side of the screen. And it's called this because 30 Seminole warriors fired on a group of soldiers found vandalizing Billy Bowlegs' camp, which marked the beginning of the Third Seminole War. And this had a lot to do with high tensions due to Jefferson Davis's policies, which included a trade embargo that pretty much forced the Seminole Native Americans to either stay and defend themselves or to leave. And this also wrapped in the Gamble and Braden plantations, which are both very close to one another, just right across the Manatee River. And so the Gamble plantation actually came out of it completely unscathed, whereas the Braden plantation did take a hit, but the family was able to defend themselves. And then we also have the Civil War, which was 1861 to 65, in which Florida successfully voted to secede from the Union on January 10th. And then this is when we see Confederate Captain Archibald McNeil stationed at the plantation with his family. And it was used to store war supplies like cannons, boots, muskets, pretty much anything that they could possibly need to try to turn the tide of the war in their favor. But because Florida is such a funky shaped state, it didn't necessarily work out in their favor, and they didn't really receive a lot of aid from the Confederate government that they should have. We also have a diary from a Confederate soldier stationed at Fort Brooke named Robert Watson, which talks about a plantation and like how the Civil War was, at Fort Brooke, and much of it seemed pretty much filled with leisure, aside from a few training exercises and a few small skirmishes. But he talks about the plantation, not specifically the Gamble plantation, but you can see on the map in the center where Fort Brooke is and the sugar plantation line up almost identically with where the Gamble plantation is located. And many instances of this are when they talk about going to get cane beer, or, his captain bringing cane beer back. And this is also where Judah P. Benjamin makes his final escape out of Florida and into Cuba, who is also the park's namesake. And so Judah P. Benjamin was a Confederate Secretary of State, and after the end of the Civil War, Confederate members were deemed criminals and traitors. And so in order to escape and not be captured, he masqueraded as a Frenchman in order to get through Georgia. And once he hit Florida, he disguised himself as a farmer. And so after about 2 weeks of staying at the Gamble plantation with at least one known Union troop raid, Benjamin left the plantation mansion and was smuggled to Cuba by Captain Frederick Tresca. And from Cuba, Benjamin made it to his final destination of England, where he lived the rest of his life and practiced law. And this is where we get to where my main focus is, the Patton occupation. And so George Patton was a wealthy cotton broker from Georgia. He bought the plantation property for $3,000 at a public auction. But he found out about the property through letters between Gamble's brother-in-law, McFarland. And McFarland tried to offer the property to Patton for $6,000 before it ended up in auction, and he said no. And it ended up working out in his favor because he ended up getting it for $3,000 cheaper. Now for Patton, this was an advantageous buy because it would give him 2 to 3 weeks over other sections in the early market because of the temperature and the climate and all that. So after a brief stay at the Braden plantation until the Gamble plantation was in his name, George Patton and his children stayed at the Braden plantation. And then once he got the land, he parceled it off for farming in the form of 10 to 40 acre plots. And this is actually what begins to usher in Ellenton, which was named after his daughter, Mary Ellen. And some of the property was actually left to some of his children. He had 13 in total, but the one that we're going to talk about the most is Dudley Patton, his youngest child. And so Dudley Patton inherits the Gamble Mansion and its immediate property, and he and his wife, Ida Melville Turner, end up having a total of 9 children in that area, as well as at the Fort Brooke area. And as they grow and everything, he ends up building the Patton house to house his family, and the Gamble Mansion ends up becoming more of like a boarding house. Now, even though they had 9 children, only 5 of them survived to adulthood. Ida had triplets, which was a very rare phenomena at the time. And you can find their grave markers in the cemetery behind the mansion. And then one other child died in infancy who is not named and does not have a grave marker, possibly being due to being stillborn. Now, with the Gamble Mansion as a boarding house, we see family members, strangers, pretty much anyone who needed a place to stay was welcome at the Gamble Mansion. And it was also used as a place for the ministers to stay, as Ellenton had no permanent pastor. Now, most, if not all, of the Patton children moved away from Ellenton as they grew older, but they returned on multiple occasions, the final of which is their burial at the Mansion Memorial State Park, located behind the Gamble Mansion. And the property was eventually sold to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1925 after the death of their mother. And it was donated to the state as a Confederate memorial to Judah P. Benjamin. And because of this, the Patton House, which is in the lower image, was moved to the back of the property so that people could get a more clear view of the Gamble Mansion, because it is the last remaining antebellum plantation house in the state of Florida, and is Greek Revival architecture with those big white columns. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy wanted to make sure that people driving by could, if they were to look, would be able to see that beautiful mansion just right off the street. So the Pattons were heavily part of Victorian consumer culture, specifically or especially as wealthy planters. And so they went to parties, they hosted parties. In 1883, Dudley Patton was on the committee of a party being held at the residence of M.C. Leffingwell. And we also see instances of the children going to dances, following proper Victorian etiquette with dance cards, chaperoning. This was all very common for his children. And as time went on, the family maintained a steady stream of latest fashion trends, latest things that were very popular as time went on. And so we see with the girls, the slim waistline silhouette was in style, and women were expected to wear, layers of clothing to maintain their modesty, which you can see in the photo of the woman on the right. The Patton House also ended up having various luxuries that we kind of assume are just expected today. Running water was incorporated into the Patton House, and a bathroom was connected to the house as an added on room as the family grew, and they eventually got a second story as well. So that means that, as far as we know, the Privy, which is what this research is about, as far as we know, that's the only one on the property. We haven't found evidence of another one. And so the possibility of the children walking out there at night didn't really seem like a good idea, considering how much was going on in the area. So adding the bathroom was definitely a big deal for that family. They also eventually got invested in a car, which you can see in the bottom on the left-hand side, which is something not many people in the area or at the time could really afford unless they were members of that high status, like social circle. And family pedigree was huge when it came to the Patton children making friends. Their parents wanted to make sure that the children, the children's friends were also of the same social circles, same kind of family pedigree as the Pattons themselves were. And specifically, because we do have a lot of interviews with Ida, one of Dudley's daughters, we do know that upper class women were held to specific standards of dress, morals, and manners. And so things like pregnancy out of wedlock was essentially social like destruction, and blush wasn't really a thing. It was only really worn by like women of the night. But Ida speaks of how when she was a child, her and her sisters would pinch their cheeks to get kind of that same color. And they were also trained in modesty and good manners, kind of alluding to that they were being raised to fill specific roles within the household and within the community. And so we get into the nitty-gritty of archaeological methods. I specifically looked at the Henry Baker survey, which was an auger survey in 1981, and well, in 1978. And then in 1981, they did a magnetometer scan, but because of high levels of ferrous metal, they decided the auger survey would yield the best data. And so they found various artifacts that we actually used to that were used to kind of like date the site or that specific occupation, such as nails, ham bones, cook stove pieces, and some ceramic sherds that dated between 1862 and 1891, which does fall right into when the Pattons were occupying the site. This was also super helpful in figuring out where to place our own excavation areas in the 2017 and 2018 field seasons. I also looked at the 2004 sugar mill survey by Roland Bland and Johnston, which they conducted 306 subsurface shovel tests while avoiding delicate structures, and 66 of those shovel tests came back positive and yielded 1,079 artifacts, which included ceramics, iron hardware, and glass bottle fragments. They also used GPR to locate any buried structural or cultural features, as well as metal detector surveys. But because the items from the metal detector surveys were deemed modern, that one ended up not being utilized. And so specifically for the Privy, in the area where we excavated, we did 1 meter by 1 meter units, and the Privy feature ended up being identified as approximately 3 feet squared and extending below the water table approximately 150 centimeters below datum. And this began in 2017. And so we didn't know it was a Privy at the time, but we were taking 10-liter bulk soil samples from the Privy feature at every 5 to 10 centimeter levels, utilizing judgment sampling, so that we could possibly find any macrobotanicals, or even be cut once it was discovered to be a Privy, possibly any like parasitic evidence. And the excavation of the other units in that same locus were conducted at 5 centimeter intervals per level, with thorough description of artifacts, level type, soil texture. Drawings were conducted of artifacts found in situ, and as well as the like soil composition and stratigraphy. For glass bottle identification, we utilized the DAX glass system, as well as the Parks Canada glass system, and occasionally Google. And for the ceramics, I utilized the DAX, University of Florida's digital ceramic type collection, the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum ceramic identification. Koval's was really helpful in identifying like maker's marks, and Society for Historical Archaeology ceramic identification, as well as, of course, good old Google and books loaned to me by my advisor, Dr. Diane Wallman. So of the ceramic analysis, I kind of found a few things that were a little interesting. So conspicuous consumption can be loosely defined as being the outwards display of wealth through the purchase of higher end goods. And ceramics are one of the most utilized artifacts when trying to understand status due to their ability to give insight into relative economic levels. And so from the Privy feature, I found and identified 478 ceramic sherds, and 57.74% were identified as whiteware, which could be possibly their like everyday use, like plates and cups, as well as due to the Gamble Mansion being used as a boarding house. And almost all of the ceramic types originate from England, which also shows that the Pattons were participating in that consumer culture and bringing, importing artifacts from overseas, or plates from overseas. And so you can kind of see on the table that 276 of my artifacts were whiteware. But if you look up, pearlware and porcelain were also some of the largest pieces of, or largest numbers of artifacts that I had for the ceramics, which are usually more expensive, especially the porcelain, and kind of show that, like, yes, they had a lot of whiteware, but they also had a good number of the more expensive wares. And so these images kind of showcase the more expensive and interesting pieces. So the top left is a part of a child's tea set, which is porcelain. And this was actually really helpful in reaffirming the Pattern social status and informs on the social ideology and structures during the 19th century. So consumptive decisions made by adults kind of reinforce specific behaviors that fall into expected gender roles befitting their socioeconomic status. And so the idea that their daughters were playing with these porcelain ceramic like tea sets kind of reaffirms that they were higher status, and that there was certain expectations for the daughters to kind of like host tea parties, like kind of fit into this specific Victorian like roles for women. The bottom left and the center are aesthetic period plates with prunus blossom motifs. And during the Victorian era, it was extremely common for wealthy members of society to display items oriental in nature and was essentially a figurative like upturned nose at mass-produced wares. And so these two plates, because they have prunus blossoms, they're actually Japanese cherry blossoms. And so these would have been something that was brought out when the Pattons were having parties, or when they had somebody over that they needed to impress and kind of say, hey, look at me, I have all this money, look at these cool plates. And the large right photo is part of a porcelain plate. I had a lot of pieces of this ceramic, and so it's very interesting because it looks like it's later 19th, early 20th century, and it has pink and green bands on the top that go all the way around. But if you were to look really closely, there's a ghosting of gold gilding in the center of the green stripe, which is very interesting. It's not the prettiest porcelain item, but it does kind of, because of how much it is, it does kind of show how much like affluence this family had, and that they had this large of a number of porcelain artifacts. For the glass bottles, 38 complete glass bottles were unearthed from the Gamble Plantation site, with 16 specifically being removed from the Privy. And so most of these, kind of varied in use. We had pharmacological ones, we had ink wells, food bottles, kind of a mix of a lot of things. But many of the pharmacological bottles had a high alcohol percentage in their like recipe. And so kind of leads to the question of, what were these more than medicine, perhaps? Because during this time period in Ida's interview, she specifically says that alcohol was not allowed in their home. It was not something they consumed out in public. But we do have instances of drunken disorderly reported specifically with the Pattons, and it kind of begs the question, like, was this actually specifically consumed for medicinal purposes? Something else to note is that one of the medicines, Dr. King's New Life pills, contained strychnine sulfate, which is actually something used in rat poison today and can cause painful muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and if exposed to high enough doses, can cause respiratory failure and brain death. So were these really helping, or were they causing kind of more problems? We do, however, see that a lot of these medicines were used to treat malaria and other ailments, kind of similar, and that these displays of drunkenness in public were possibly overlooked just because of the medicinal purposes of these medicines. Ida Patton, Dudley's daughter, was arrested on several occasions for drunken disorderly, and her uncle, Edward Patton, was brought to court for illegally selling liquor. So we do know that alcohol kind of played a part in this family's, like, at least adult lives. And so these are just some of the examples of the glass bottles, specifically the medicinal bottles. The top left is Warner's Safe Kidney and Liver Cure, and it had like liverwort, bugleweed extract, wintergreen extract, potassium nitrate. It had 90% alcohol and contained glycerin. So that one was like super high alcohol, and it was supposed to stimulate like digestion, awaken the liver, and restore the kidneys, which at that percentage, I don't necessarily think was true. The bottom left is the small bottle for the Dr. King's New Life pills, and that had cascara, podophyllin, aloin, strychnine sulfate, and capsicum, and was supposed to aid with malaria, jaundice, fever, and constipation. The center one is Grove's Tasteless Chill Tonic, which is the only medicinal bottle found that didn't have an alcohol content, and it was specifically to treat malaria in mosquito dense areas, and it contained reduced iron. I know I'm going to butcher these names, cincinine or cincinidine, sugar syrup, and lemon flavor. And everything I've read said that this was not tasteless. It tasted awful. Nobody enjoyed taking it. And then the far right is pain celery compound, which contained celery seed, calisaya bark, cascara, senna leaves, prickly dandelion, mandrake, gentian, black cohosh, and yellow dock. And it also had a 21% alcohol. And this one was supposed to aid with mental exhaustion, rheumatism, and kidney troubles. And again, with such a high alcohol content, I don't really think it might have been that beneficial, to be honest. And wow, I've been talking so fast, so I am so sorry. I am already at my conclusion. So life on the frontier wasn't without its struggles. Like we saw malaria, yellow fever outbreaks, high infant mortality rates, especially among the Dudley Patton and his wife, where they lost 4 out of their 9 children. And even though the Patton family was kind of, you know, deep in with these struggles, especially, you know, next to the river and kind of like in the more like wetland area, they managed to keep up with the changing Victorian consumer culture patterns. And especially to them, appearances were meant to be maintained. Their children were supposed to follow specific expectations. And so understanding this consumptive pattern, the consumptive patterns of the Pattons through their ceramics and glass bottles kind of sheds a lot of light on how people in the 19th century lived on the frontier and how they kind of dealt with these hardships, perhaps in the form of high alcohol medicines, and how they maintained their high status Victorian lifestyle. And thank you.